please. Ingvill Moe Elgsaas is a senior fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. She has a PhD in political science from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, and an MPhil in Russian and East European Studies from Oxford. Among her research interests is the interface between Russian political elites and economic or security-related interest groups. And in her contribution to the project here, Rus Ecopol, she looks at Russia's strategic companies, including patterns of oligarch and Silovik leadership, with particular attention to strategic companies exploiting Russia's metal resources in the Arctic. So, Ingvill, the floor is yours. We're eager to hear about your report on state-business relations in the Murmansk region. Please.
Thank you. So, to start us off, what can I say about Murmansk? On the one hand, it's an average region, just one among very many oblasts in the Russian Federation, but on the other hand, it's a very special region. It is strategically important, and especially so in light of Russia's ambitious plans for the Arctic. The Murmansk region is very central to Russia's plans for the Arctic. It's also central for the country's economic development, as well as its military capabilities and its ability to project these capabilities. It is a gateway towards the Northern Sea route further to the east. So all of these things makes it very important, both economically and also militarily. It is the home base of the Northern Fleet, and since 2014 it has also been the home to the headquarters of Russia's new strategic command North. And combining all these economic interests, I should mention that mining and metallurgy is very central, fisheries as well. Combining these economic interests and the military interests in one region makes this region particularly important politically as well. So what I'll do today is present some findings from my studies of the political elite in the Murmansk region. Now the background, let me see if that's correct, yeah. I'll leave you to read that while I just quickly say that the background for this study is this understanding that interest groups have co-opted political power in Russia, and we've already heard a lot spoken about oligarchs and Siloviki. And the model showed by Andrei Yakovlev showed how the oligarchs were presumably very strong in the 1990s, but then the Siloviks have come and built up, and the relative weight of them have shifted over to the Siloviks. Most of these studies into these interest groups focus on the federal level, not exclusively, but there's a lot of focus on the federal level. And there is a question of how this manifests itself in Russia's regions. And it has also been mentioned already that the oligarchs sort of entered a conflict with the bureaucracy in 2002-2003, and presumably this sort of started was the start of the end of oligarchic power on the federal level. At the same time, it has been claimed that at this point in time, the oligarchies were alive and well, they were just in the regions. So practically in every region across Russia, there was an own oligarchy with oligarchic interest groups having taken over gubernatorial power. Many of you are probably familiar with the studies of Krishnanovskaya and White on how the Siloviks moved into the political elite, and over just a few years in the early 2000s, as many as 1 in 4 members of the political elite in Russia was considered to be a Silovik. These numbers have been debated, and it's not entirely clear, but they also noted that the move of Siloviks into the political elite was especially notable in the regions. So my question then is, how is all of this playing out in the Murmansk region, a strategically important region with lots of military capabilities and also some core economic interests? So what I have done is that I have subjected the political elite in Murmansk to an in-depth study of representation from select sectors, 3 economic sectors that reflect the economic mainstays, as well as future prospects of the region, so mining and metallurgy, fishery and energy, and security, i.e. the Siloviks, to see how well these are represented in the regional political elite and how this representation has evolved across the post-Soviet period. So the political elite I analyzed it in two parts, reflecting the divide between legislative and executive power. So the legislative elite, the regional parliament, and the executive elite, the regional government. And instead of focusing on specific decisions and who got their way in this on that particular matter, which is very interesting but doesn't really tell us anything about the system and the systemic power that these sectors hold, I've opted for the positional approach. So literally people holding specific positions in these sectors and then taking up political offices vested with political power. So I'll just move straight along to some results. This table here shows the regional parliament. So it was first convened in 1994 and it is currently in its 6th convocation or term. As you can see, I've included the number of seats just that you can see the relative weight, because it's actually straightforward when it comes to the regional parliament, because 1 seat in the assembly equals 1 vote. So if you have a certain number of sector representatives, then they literally hold a certain number of votes towards the assembly's decisions. So within the red square, you see the number of sector representatives for each term. And then you can compare it to the number of seats overall. So then you can see the relative voting strength of the sector representatives. And as you can see, it started off with about a quarter of the seats being held by sector representatives. Then there was a jump to just over half of the seats in the second term. And since then, it has sort of remained relatively stable at around half of the seats in the regional parliament being occupied by sector representatives. I should mention that the electoral procedures have changed over the course of this period, and most significantly between the 3rd and the 4th term, when they departed from the only majoritarian races to it being a mixed system with majoritarian races, but also proportional representation based on party lists. But as you can see, this didn't really change anything in terms of the number of sector representatives that continued to be recruited, elected into the parliament. Of course, this is sector representatives seen together. So that's all of them. So these are sector representatives presumably pulling in different directions. But if we then sort of unwrap these results and look at what sectors were represented in each of them, we see that the M&Ms, the mining and metallurgy, they are by far the strongest ones, and that's how it has been throughout the entire period. Security started off sort of with just 1, but they have gradually increased over time, and now they're almost on par with the miners, mining and metallurgy. So they're quite a big group as well. Fishery started low, and I know the fishery sector was very disappointed in this, that they couldn't elect more since they consider themselves this region of fishermen. So they started increasing a bit, but then again they have decreased. So there are not many. Today there's just 1 representative from the fishery sector. Energy is a bit tricky to describe because it fluctuates greatly. It's difficult to speak of any trends. There were none at first, then there were quite a few. Decreased, and last term there were 5. Today there's 3 of them. But the overall finding is the sort of relatively well representation from mining and metallurgy, and the increase in representation from security. And so examples here, I'm not going to really go in on a lower level, but of course these are different businesses and different organizations. They're not all from one same. So Pechenga Nickel, Sierra Nickel, and once they were merged into Kolskaya GMK, which is always represented. Apatit is always represented. Amongst the Siloviki, the Northern Fleet, I think, is the best represented. So this is then the legislative branch of the regional political elite, and how sector representation in this assembly has evolved across the post-Soviet period. I'll just press on. I hope I'm good for time. To the government in the region. Now this is a bit trickier because the government is very much dominated by the governor, and they discuss things, but the governor has the final say. So it's not a matter of if you have so and so many representatives, then you have so and so many votes like it is in the parliament. But still, being included in the regional government comes with some leeway, some access to the governor, and potential to at the very least state one's case and potentially influence positions. If you see at the bottom figure, that one's cut short, isn't it? That's unfortunate. Okay, so the bottom figure, I'll just explain it, since this is all missing. So this is the composition of the regional government. So the green one, 45%, those are sector representatives. The blue, that's everyone else that I haven't identified as sector representatives. The yellow is people whose biographies are not detailed enough. I haven't really managed to ascertain whether I can trust that they don't represent a sector or not. So these are the unknowns. And so there will be more of these figures coming, but just so. This is the sector representative one. And the specific sectors, mining and metallurgy, security, fishery, and energy. It's not possible to get the text into the picture, is it, Jardar? Well, if it becomes unclear, then just give us a shout. So the first governor was appointed right before the Soviet Union ended in 1991. He immediately set about his task, and he was very explicit about his official policy of including the directors, the heads of regional big business and security agencies in his government as a matter of official policy. That was laid down in the regional administration's regulations. So there was no secret about this, and they were listed in government as director of Pechenga Nickel. It was their function in his government. Okay, well, we'll press on, I hope so. So metallurgy and security, the two top ones there. Yep. Moving on, Komarov lost the very first election in the region to Yevdokimov, who carried on much in the same way, increased sector representation overall, and you can see there's some differences, but metallurgy on top, as before. Yevdokimov was re-elected multiple times and secured all of the initial direct elections in the region, kept on increasing sector representation in his governments, and you can see there's a clear trend. And here, 62% of sector representatives amongst his members of government. Did I do that? Okay. So, something funny now happened. I mean, the political environment had changed over time, and these elected governors were no longer well seen. You were now supposed to become the president's governor. So Yevdokimov voluntarily stepped down so that he could secure the so-called approved governorship and be nominated by the president and then elected by the regional parliament. And that's when his government sort of also changed a bit, and he decreased sector representation, presumably, although the unknowns of members also increased, so we have to keep that in mind. And the different sectors also changed a bit, but not markedly. The big change came when Yevdokimov was replaced with a genuine Varyak sent up from Moscow to rein in the regional elite and the interests that had grown naturally in the region. So the lowest sector representation we've seen, but with a huge, uncomfortable yellow unknown. The sectors are very different from previous governments, with massive increase in security, fishery gone, and energy increased massively as well. Dmitrienko allegedly didn't do a very good job and had to be replaced by Kovtun, who I like to see as sort of a cross between Dmitrienko, who owed his loyalty to the Federation, and Yevdokimov, who was very good at regional interests and managing these. So Kovtun was the second, well, technically third, appointed governor, but she was in tune with regional interest groups, and she immediately started increasing membership from sector representatives. And it's not entirely clear quite yet, but she started normalizing the sectors as well. That became clearer in her second government after she voluntarily stepped down so that she could secure an elected mandate, because that was now the thing to be had. The fishery sector, though, has never recovered. So last year, she also had to go, more or less believably voluntarily, and was replaced by the region's second Varyak, sent up from Moscow, with no connection to the region before. This Chibis, I think, would be very much the young technocrat that Yekaterina was talking about. And this is very fresh. So obviously, these are completed governments. This one is quite new, so these numbers will presumably be updated quite a bit, but as yet, just a quarter of his members of government are sector representatives. Quite a lot of unknowns as yet, and sector representation looks a bit different than before. Now, whether this is the end of traditional sector representation in the regional government as we know it, we don't know, but it's interesting to see. Now, concluding, I assume I'm out of time. So yeah, sector representatives definitely seek and attain political offices in the Murmansk region. So it's considerable sector representation, but no one sector has dominated in terms of their numbers, and then needless to say, no one organization or company has dominated in terms of their numbers. But Marina Kofton, who was a sector representative herself from mining and metallurgy sector, was, she's the single most important member of the regional elite, so that is heavy weighing. Changes in recruitment procedures have affected sector representation in the government, but not in the regional parliament. So today the situation is so that half of the seats in the regional parliament are held by sector representatives. There is quite little sector representation in the regional government as yet. It'll be interesting to see how this develops. And the importance of the Murmansk region and how it operates, how it is being operated, will presumably increase in interest in the years to come. I think there's an Arctic strategy soon to come out, and Russia is about to take on the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Certainly today these things are overshadowed by recent events in Moscow, but in the time to come, the Murmansk region and its elite will probably not be any less relevant, and I'll stop there. Sorry.